Eden Rivers Trust. So Andy's going to start us off by talking through DEFRA's clean air strategy and what that might mean for things like low emission spreading equipment and a possible proposal to cover all slurry and manure stores by 2027. So he's going to set out the regulations. We're then going to go on to Susan Kenworth from Natural England. She's the Catchment Sensitive Farming Officer for the River Eden. And actually the other Catchment Sensitive Farming Officer for the Eden, Chris Turner, is also on the call and can help us with questions tonight. And Susan's going to give a presentation about the water capital and air quality grants and the proposed slurry investment scheme. We're then going to hand back to Andy, and Andy's going to go through a case study of a farmer that hopefully also is on the call tonight. And just focusing on the need to plan for the investment and what you might want to do when. And we're going to take a break for questions after each of those talks. And because of the numbers on the call, it's going to be harder than normal to see whether people are wanting to ask questions. What I've done on the bottom, I've taken a screenshot of what I see on my Zoom call, and hopefully those of you on computers will also see this on the bottom of your screen. I'm not so sure on phones and iPads, but what I just wanted to highlight was on the left-hand side, you've got a mute and unmute button. When everybody joined, I've muted everybody as you came in because otherwise the sound would be chaos. So if you do want to ask a question and you're not managing to use the chat function, just click on that and unmute yourself and just say, Veronica, want to ask a question. Also, next to that is the video function. And if you are having broadband problems or you don't want us to see you, and I have to say we are recording the meeting, partly because there's people that weren't able to join tonight that want to watch the presentations. So if you're not happy with your face showing or your broadband connection is not great, you can stop your video using that button. That's the participant list. That was from a meeting I had earlier today. Actually on tonight, we've got over 85 on the call, so there'll be an awful lot more than that on our screen. This one here is the chat function. So I do like to take discussions and questions, but given the numbers on the call, if you want to and you're able to, click on that and you can type in the question, or you can say, "Oi, Veronica, I want to ask a question, please ask me." The other ones on share screen and record aren't relevant for yourselves. That's something that the speakers will be using. And if you want to do a reaction and be very clever, you can click on this and have a play with that as well. You can have thumbs up or smiley face or not smiley face, whatever is appropriate. And if you want to leave the call, please leave. But hopefully we'll keep you interested till the end of the session. So I'm your chairman tonight. I'm Veronica Waller. I work for the Farmer Network, and I'm going to just stop sharing my screen and hand over to our first speaker, which is Andy Dyer from Eden Rivers Trust, and he's going to cover the Clean Air Act and the implications for the investment that you might require over the next few years. So I'll just give Andy a second whilst he just tries to share his screen and his presentation, and we will take questions after Andy's first presentation.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. For some reason, I've got disabled screen sharing at the moment, so whether that's just something that's clicked in, is that okay?
Just a second, Andy. I will. Okay, so that should be enabled now, Andy. Sorry about that.
Not at all. Oh, okay. Right. Now, hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, thank you, Veronica, and also thanks to Ruth, who's helping in the background there, sort of keep control of our speakers there. So good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My first bit of my presentation, I don't intend to sort of really go into great depth. I'm more interested really in sort of a stimulating discussion, hopefully get some questions through. And as Veronica says, this is all getting recorded and will be available afterwards. So, you know, please do come back to me if there are any more detailed questions there. I feel that tonight, hopefully, we've got some slightly better news or some slightly more interesting news than what's going on the BBC tonight, with Boris giving us a bit of his roadmap for the way ahead. But hopefully this will give us some food for thought and maybe begin to get us on that road with what's coming ahead. So we've certainly come through a lot of these stormy waters and troubled times just recently. A lot of us who have been involved with the whole process of the discussion over the last 2 or 3 years felt at times that we probably were going round in circles. But hopefully now we do see a bit of a way forward. In terms of the environmental permitting regulations, this is coming out of the DEFRA Clean Air Strategy, which was published back in 2019. You're coming up for nearly 2 years ago now. And this sort of, you know, as it says there, stated that at that time, air pollution was the 4th biggest threat to public health. And we needed to work out how we were going to try and improve public health by reducing human exposure to particulate matter, which primarily arises, of course, from road pollution. And ammonia, which is very much part of these environmental permitting regulations, combines with particulate matter. And that is where the problem is. Ammonia itself is not a greenhouse gas, so is separated from those. But because of its impact, in direct impact on habitat, in terms of the nitrogen that's in there and the sort of the impact that has on the fertility of habitats, but also in terms of the ammonia mixing with or reacting with the particulate matter, and then giving rise to human health problems. And probably as worrying as anything else is the recent research, which many of you have picked up on, is that because of the fact that the particulate matter causes lung inflammation, then this can potentially lead to an increased susceptibility to COVID-19. Also, this is arising from the COGAP, the Code of Good Agricultural Practice for Reducing Ammonia Emissions, which was produced a year earlier. And the strategy really built on that COGAP and then began to move forward to push this forward into legislation. So the COGAP really focused on 5 or 6 main areas as to where there was a need for improving people's knowledge, possibly increasing regulation, but generally just raising the whole profile within the industry. And I know Susan will talk a little bit more about some of the background to where a lot of this came from the Dame Glenys Stacey review. But really, I'm not going to talk through those one by one, but really the key things were in terms of making sure there's enough storage on farm, and we'll talk more about the slurry investment scheme in due course, which is coming in the next couple of years. Things that are already in place, a lot of these regulations and a lot of these sort of ideas and background information was coming out of the IPPC regulations, which those of you who've got big pig and poultry units will be well aware of already. And the environmental permitting regs are designed in the long term to sort of transfer quite a bit of that legislation and regulation through into the dairy industry and the intensive beef industries for a start off. So things like nutrient management planning, spreading the right amount in the right place at the right time, a phrase that has tended to become quite commonplace these days. And things like the splash plates, reducing ammonia emissions from those, and incorporating materials where possible. Again, this is all linked potentially also into things like the Farming Rules for Water, which another raft of regulation that sort of came in 2018 and is now up for its 3 years review, where there's nutrient management planning required. You'll be aware also that there was the urea consultation from DEFRA just around Christmas, early New Year, where the industry got to comment on DEFRA's proposals for effectively removing urea-based fertilizers from the agricultural industry. And the consultation was very much around what mitigation measures could be put in place, such as using urease inhibitors and adopting really good practice. So, spreading, as I say, when rainfall is due, and applying other fertilizers in cool, moist conditions. So trying to reduce that volatilization of the ammonia that is released from these fertilizers in warm conditions. Other things that are coming through, and I sit on the what's called the technical working group for the environmental permitting regs with DEFRA and EA and Natural England, and a whole range of people right across the whole agricultural industry, not just in England, but also in Wales and in Northern Ireland and in Scotland as well, all feeding into a fairly big platform, and we're all split into various groups. What we've been looking at as well is with the professionals is looking at how potentially your livestock diets can be manipulated to help reduce ammonia emissions from cattle, though there is a perceived conflict in that, in terms of that when you're trying to reduce ammonia, NH3, that also you're impacting on the methane production of those animals as well, which is a greenhouse gas. But for those of us who run AD plants or are involved in AD, then anaerobic digestion, then methane is what you want for driving the generators. And Susan will cover a bit more in terms of the things that have come through in the current stewardship scheme, in terms of looking at how ammonia emissions can be reduced from animal and livestock housing. So much more regular cleaning, washing down. We know that both dung and urine produce ammonia, but when they're combined together, they produce that much more quickly. So the sooner you can either separate the two, or potentially then enclose the two within some chamber or in other ways to then try and limit the amount of ammonia that's produced, and then allow the bugs in the slurry, and they will naturally break down the ammonia eventually. Then the quicker that can happen, then the potential, the lower the ammonia levels will be in the housing. And this is well known within the pig and poultry industry, and with things like ammonia scrubbers in pig and poultry houses that effectively scrub the air of the ammonia as it's removed from the housing. So just to finish my little bit of the talk before I hand over to Susan, then there are a few things to consider which are definitely coming on the horizon. This has been well telegraphed really, is that splash plate spreading will be banned post 2025. It's going to come in a bit faster in Northern Ireland, but certainly here in England it will be banned then, and we'll be moving to your umbilical dribble bar, or shallow or deep injection. And then the proposal is that currently all slurry stores would be required to be covered by 2027. There's still a huge amount of debate on this, and this may translate initially to the fact that all new covers will also all new stores will have to be covered, which, as we come on to talk about the slurry investment scheme, then that will be very much part and parcel of that whole grant system, and then a progressive rollout thereafter. But I think the key message that we're hoping to try and get through tonight is that this is the golden opportunity to begin to plan ahead. We have a number of years now to all get our houses in order, no matter where we're farming or what business we're involved in, the support side of things as well. And the sooner we can talk to the industry professionals and advisors to see how your existing store could be covered, can it, or then what are the alternatives, and then the rest of this talk, when we look at more about the slurry investment scheme, will hopefully mean that those discussions will already be well advanced by the time we get to there. So that's me, thank you.
Okay, Andy, so we're starting to get questions in, and thank you. Maybe if you could stop sharing the screen. And,
yep, I'll do that. Yep.
I've got three or four questions in already, which is brilliant. I'm going to start with Stephen Crabtree. And Stephen, it might just be easier if I ask your question rather than asking you to unmute. So Stephen's got a question here. Does a slurry separator reduce the ammonia?
My understanding is yes, it does. Therefore, if you're then able to deal with those two separate portions of the slurry, then you will be helping to contribute to ammonia, your reduction in ammonia emissions on your holding.
And again, I think from Christine Grange, who's probably got a follow-on question to that, do underground holding tanks reduce ammonia?
Yes, they do. And again, Susan will hopefully cover that in terms of the air quality item for slat design that's coming in as part of, is coming in now as the new grants, part of the new grant scheme. But certainly, as I think I said in my talk, that the sooner you can get those materials into an area where they can be contained and where that ammonia then has the opportunity to be broken down, by the bugs in the slurry itself, then the better there will be in terms of your overall ammonia emissions. Okay,
so then the next question, it says Diane Gibson, but I'm just wondering if that's John. And it's to everybody. Any more news on dairy permitting and timescales? So you covered a bit of the possible timescales in your last slide, Andy. But when are we likely to know more about, whether this is definitely coming in and by when?
No, thank you, John. Again, this process has been slowed down in terms of the discussion by COVID and the inability of, to get us all together around a table. And in fact, it's become a bit more fragmented, this discussion with DEFRA and EA. But we're beginning now to see a bit more cohesion to the discussion. I would anticipate that within the next couple of years, probably around the time that we're sort of getting towards the end of the slurry investment scheme, that we'll begin to see much more clarity as to what's happening with the whole environmental permitting regulations. And particularly, there's been quite a lot of speculation about size of herd, where the tipping point will be, and the definition. I mean, this is where the crucial thing is the definition. Things like intensive beef. What's an intensive beef unit? How big a dairy herd? We've explained time and time to DEFRA that you can't apply a sort of arbitrary cross figure where if you've got more than 150 cows, you're an intensive dairy unit, and you've got less, you're not, because we all know there are plenty of very extensive dairy units, in Cumbria and in other areas where grass growth is predominant, down into Devon and Cornwall, where these herds are managed, certainly 9 to 10 months of the year outside, so they're not a house for any great periods of time. So we've still a long way to go in terms of getting some of the background stuff sorted out. But yeah, I think within the next 2 years, John.
So I'm just going to look through some of these questions. I've got one is saying, what about slatted livestock housing? Are they classed as covered?
Not at the moment, no. But Susan will probably talk a little bit more about the air quality item that is coming in, which is an enhanced slat design. So therefore is designed to help trap that ammonia within the slatted tanks. Certainly better than having a completely uncovered tank. And if those tanks are, undercover in sheds, then they will certainly be releasing less ammonia than anything that's outside, where you've got constant airflow over the top of that slatted tank, which then potentially can pull the ammonia up and out into the atmosphere.
And I'm going to keep running through these. I was a bit worried we won't get any questions, but we've got lots coming in, so that's brilliant. Yeah. Christine again, how will we incorporate manure into the ground within 12 hours?
This is designed for the arable side of things. So if you're on grassland, then that's not seen to be as big an issue. So yeah, that's still subject to your code of good agricultural practice, your normal sort of farming rules for water stipulations, and the normal way of farming. Then grassland, putting manure on grassland, you're not supposed to then go and incorporate that.
And then Tim from a Separator of Farmers, in Denmark, we have seen farmers adding sulfuric acid to slurry to lower ammonia levels. Is that approved in the UK?
Not approved as yet, but again, that's all part of the consultation process and has been discussed at high level with DEFRA, as it's seen as one of the potential options. And I stress it's one of the potential options. I think what we'll see coming out of all this is probably a wide range of options that people can adopt, for their particular sector of the industry. And yeah, adding sulfuric acid, tried and tested abroad, but again, something that for those of us particularly who were involved in the potato industry a number of years ago, using sulfuric acid to burn off potato crops, it's not a chemical that you want to be splashing about too much at all.
And final one on our chat, and then I'm going to just ask people if they want to say, if they're not able to use chat, just say something verbally. Is there any link between ammonia levels and the increased use of Adblue? Andy, you've muted yourself. Maybe it's because you weren't sure of the answer.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm trying to. Right. No, that's okay. Back on again. Yeah, extremely good question. Adblue is a chemical that actually then reacts with the exhaust emissions, so it doesn't actually increase the ammonia levels. It's designed to remove the not just to remove the noxious gases from within the exhaust. But yeah, very good question, because it is urea, obviously, that's in Adblue. So you would think that it would add to the problem. But yeah, I had this question on another discussion, and I'm not going to try and test my A-level chemistry too much in terms of the formula, but I can say that certainly it's not an issue.
So we've had a number of questions on the chat, and thank you everybody that's put those in. Just for people particularly who are on phones or iPads, you may not find it easy to use a chat function. Does anybody want to shout up and ask a question? If you do, you do need to unmute yourself or wave at me frantically like that. So does anybody want to? I've got a Graham waving at me. I can see somebody waving at me. I'm looking through. No, he's shaking his head. Right, I don't want people to feel they've not been able to ask questions. So I'm just going to go through my list, see if anybody's frantically waving. So just at the moment, I'm hoping nobody is. Edward Dent's waving his pen around, but maybe that's a question. Okay. So speak now. We've got lots of opportunity for further questions later on. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Susan, and Susan's going to talk through the grants that are available through stewardship and what we know so far about the Slurry investment scheme. For those of you who can, if you can carry on putting your questions on chat, and I'll also give people an opportunity after Susan's talk to ask again. But please speak up if you want to ask a question and you're not able to use the chat function. So I'm going to hand over to Susan Kenworthy, who's the Catchment Sensitive Farming Officer for the River Eden. Susan, you need to unmute.
Hi everyone. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Let's try and make sure this is working properly. Right, okay. Right, thanks very much for joining. Thanks very much to Andy for the sort of background into the sort of legislations that, the background into what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm just going to cover a little bit about my role and a little bit about how Chris and I can help you with some of the changes that are coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to the grant funding and the advice and why that's needed. I'm going to talk about some of the types of help and advice available and give you some tips as to how you make a successful application. And then we'll just go through a couple of case studies of some representative farms and farms that have had grants in the past. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the Slurry Investment Fund, which is a separate strand or stream of funding, which we hope will be coming up in the fairly near future. So my role is a catchment sensitive farming officer. I've shared on the screen there, hopefully, what should be a view of the Eden catchment in red. But I know that Veronica's told me that there's farmers from further afield, there's farmers from throughout Cumbria, Lancashire and Yorkshire are on the call as well. So all those areas, there's plenty of areas within that are covered by catchment sensitive farming. You can find those on Magic. So Chris and I cover the River Eden for catchment sensitive farming, and our role is to help support farmers with advice to reduce diffuse pollution to air and water. And we can do that in lots of different ways. We can offer you practical on-farm one-to-one advice around maybe sort of soil sampling, nutrient budgeting, around advice around kind of farm infrastructure and slurry manure management, that type of thing, but also help you with access to grants as well, which is what we're talking about tonight. Now, the reason it's those colours is that the red area that you can see is what we consider to be a high priority for water quality. And that means that in those areas, it means that you are eligible to apply for a grant. There's a very little bit of yellow, which is medium priority. So it means we can still talk to you, but in those areas, you won't be able to apply for a grant just yet. And just near the very top, there's a little bit that's no priority at all, where we don't really tend to apply catchment sensitive farming in those areas. So because it's a huge catchment, Chris and I split our work between the different areas of the whole catchment. So I would tend to work in the Upper Eden, the Emont and the Coldew, and Chris covers the Petrel, the Min River and the Eskin, Irthing and Lyne catchments in the north. So we are, as Veronica's explained, we work for Natural England, we're government employees. So the advice that we give you is neutral and confidential. So if I just move on a little bit into, just very briefly, because I know that a lot of you have been on these talks and things before, about sort of background into why it's really important to think about funding and grants and that kind of thing just now, is that a lot of you will be aware of the changes to funding streams within the farming industry. And you know that as BPS is being phased out, we'll also move into a different realm of environmental payments as well. And you can see from that graphic there that the sort of the bright green kind of colour, which will be the funding available for ELM, which is the next phase of environmental and farm funding, is not going to match what was available through BPS and the older legacy stewardship schemes. So we know that it's really a time of reckoning for the farming industry to kind of think, right, how can I make a change? What difference does this make? And it means that we either maximize profits and reduce inefficiencies, and that really means that we have to think about it, think very carefully and plan ahead and think about how to invest in our industry, in our farms, in our businesses. So why do we need change? Why is it important? Why is it important right now? And Andy's gone into really quite a bit of detail about some of the background, the core gap and that kind of thing, which has then been the sort of the kind of underpinning of the legislation that's coming now. So if any of these two pictures that Chris has taken relatively recently, both within the Eden catchment, and if any of that looks familiar, then you know that investment is going to be needed. So we're looking at why is change needed? And it's to help you comply with current and new legislation. So the Water Framework Directive has been around for the longest, and that gives us our framework for our water quality. We also have the Farming Rules for Water, which was derived from the Core Gap and the Clean Air Act, which Andy was talking about as well. So all those types of things around spreading on frozen ground, on waterlogged ground, all that kind of thing are contained within those regulations, and about broadcast spreading, use of kind of like, using like rain guns to spread slurry are all really the regulations around that are contained within current legislation. It's also, we need change to help understand the support that's going to be available to help the farming industry become resilient to the new markets that we've got now, and to sort of changing environmental conditions as well, and also to help the industry respond for a need for investment in our infrastructure. We know that, sort of looking at some of the information that we've had from the Dame Glenys Stacey review, that there are, where did I write this down? So there are about 4,500 less dairy farms than there were 15 years ago, but we also know that there are around 29 million tonnes of slurry produced every year. So again, so we've got a kind of real context there of intensification against infrastructure to manage and hold slurry, which is really kind of getting to or beyond its lifespan. A lot of that infrastructure was built maybe 20, 30 years ago with a 20 or 30 year lifespan. So we've got that context of slurry and manure management on farms that are being intensified. The industry overall is being intensified and is struggling to cope. So within that review, it was assessed that of the 10,000 or so slurry stores in England, about 50% were inadequate in terms of size or construction. So within that, we know that about 14 million tonnes of slurry is applied inappropriately every year. So that potentially means 14 million tonnes of slurry reaching the environment in a way that really isn't optimal, that isn't helping your crops grow, which is really what we're looking for. So what does this mean for Cumbria? The majority of England's dairy and livestock farming is concentrated in the west, where we get the best grass production because it's the wettest. We have the wettest weather. It means that our infrastructure has to cope with not only the kind of volumes of slurry that are being produced, that 29 million tonnes, but also the volumes of rainwater that are collected in dirty yard areas that are collected as effluents, as silage effluent, that kind of thing, that you need to store as slurry. That is around, we get a kind of rainfall average in Cumbria of around about sort of 60 inches. So if you kind of spread that across your farm infrastructure, if any of that is getting in to any of your sort of slurry or manure storage, that's being stored as slurry, where it should really be allowed to go back into a clean water system. But also in Cumbria, that's particularly meaningful for us is that we have the highest concentrations of protected sites in the country as well, which can be impacted upon by diffuse pollution. So those are our protected waterways, heaths, bogs, forests, meadows, grasslands, all that type of thing. So thinking about why that's important, why we need that. So what is available? So a lot of you have been really familiar. I know that a lot of people on the call have already spoken to us in the past about the sorts of grants that are available. And are familiar with the types of things that we do to help you separate clean and dirty water, to help you reduce diffuse pollution. So the usual types of things around putting roofs over middens, putting roofs over silage clamps, helping you with some revenue options, looking at hedgerows and boundaries, all those types of things. So we've got two new streams, I suppose, of the way of looking at it. So we've got hedgerow and boundary and water capital. It's all rolled into one now, called the expanded capital, and we also have mid-tier countryside stewardship. So those two things are quite different from what you might have been used to last year. Is that the expanded capital is now, you have there's a lot more budget within that the maximum used to be £10,000, is now 60,000 that's split up into water quality items, 20,000 for boundary items and 20,000 for air quality items. So you could potentially have a grant application there of around about £60,000. And the mid-tier, which is open as well, which is now also limited to £150,000 for the capital within that, but has the usual sort of suite of revenue options as well. So there are some scheme changes. It's been every year it's subject to review. The RPA and DEFRA kind of have a look at what's working and what could be changed. So where mid-tier only capital applications are no longer available. So mid-tier is now capital and revenue options, but the capital option has been replaced with a new capital offer, which is expanded capital that was on the previous slide. Every time we make a stewardship application, it's about the environment. It's got environmental objectives. So there's a new objective this year, which is air quality, and we have new options within that to help you work on reducing ammonia emissions from your farm. Greening requirements have been removed, and there are uplands improvements that uplands offer, where the UP2 rough grazing for birds options have been expanded a little bit, and there are new wood pasture options to help you apply for more forestry types of things. I know everybody asks us about that. I think it's something that a lot of farmers are really interested in, and we now also have educational access in mid-tier and higher tier, which is really good. Does not cover, so I just wanted to kind of go into a couple of things that people sometimes ask us about. So it doesn't really cover sort of maintenance of farm, but I've taken this slide directly out of the manual. It doesn't cover maintenance of farm boundaries or creating new farm boundaries. It doesn't cover, it's really important, doesn't cover any capital works done before your agreement starts or any materials ordered before your agreement starts. Everything has to start, including the purchase of your materials after your agreement start date. Doesn't include fees. It doesn't include any types of things that you might have to do that you've already got a legal obligation to do, and any works on common ground. So what I would advise you to do is, if you think about making an application or you do get an agreement, is to read the manual really carefully. So I've got some key dates, and I'm going to go into these as well, and obviously the slides are going to be available for you. I don't want to bamboozle you with the dates. Both grant schemes are available just now, are open just now. The expanded capital closes at the end of April, but what's really important is that if you want to apply for that, is that you contact either me or Chris 6 weeks before you submit your application. So the very last date that we need your proposal form is the 19th of March. Again, the key dates are mid-tier. Mid-tier is going to close for applications on the 30th of July, and you need to get your proposal to us at the very latest by the 18th of June. If we don't receive those proposals, we won't be able to support you, and I do appreciate that, certainly for the expanded capital, it's a very short time span. So, again, I've taken this from the manual as well, so it's just to kind of reiterate what the spending caps are, but also a little bit more information, which is a change for this year as well, is that you can only make one application per SBI per year. So what that means is that you can't have an expanded capital and a mid-tier this year. Although what we have understood is that you can make successive applications in successive years, but you can only make one application per year per SBI. So we're talking about grants and that kind of thing, and thinking about what kind of advice is available. So, and I have kind of gone into that a little bit more, sort of the one-to-one practical advice that we can offer you if you're kind of thinking, well, I'm interested in this, but I don't really know where to start. So a good place to start is looking at your farm infrastructure first. I am going to go into a couple of case studies about how that works, but these are some of the types of examples of things that we can help you with, particularly around costing, slurry and manure storage as well, and thinking about the sort of locations and structures that you might need. We also have some more advice as well there that we can offer you specifically that Andy touched on as well, which is around reducing ammonia emissions through animal diets as well, which we have specialist advice for that too. So some of the options that are very specifically directed towards slurry storage particularly are the covers. So we've got covers which are for lagoons and covers which are for sort of like kind of tin tanks, that kind of thing. Both of those require support from us first of all, but a change this year as well is for covers to go over digestate stores as well. So these help reduce ammonia emissions to help fulfil our clean air obligations by around 60 to 80%. And now the variation within those figures is not because there's kind of any kind of variations or doubt about the evidence. It's to do with the environmental conditions around the store, that the hotter and windier it is, the more ammonia is produced. So they reduce ammonia emissions, they certainly reduce phosphate losses to water. It maximises your storage volume by reducing the amount of rainwater that actually goes into the store, which means that you can maximise and optimise your spreading as well, so that you don't have so much slurry that you're having to spread in the winter when it's, your grass is not growing, it's not feeding any crop. So we've got a little, a really kind of short example here of an example farm in Cumbria where a farmer covered a 3 million gallon store with a cover through a grant, and estimated that around about a saving of around £6,500 was made by by reducing the amount of tankering out of the store. And you can see from that second picture the amount of rainwater that was gathered just in 1 week from there. So there are some issues, there are some additional costs that need to be factored in around siphoning off that rainwater, making sure that goes away into a clean drain. But some of the kind of aspects that you kind of need to think about in that, every store is going to be different, or all your farms are different, so it kind of depends on your bedding material, what happens to the sand, how do we think about how that's going to be agitated. But also one of the kind of really important factors around that is that the quality of slurry that you get underneath that cover is going to have a higher dry matter and nitrogen content. So whatever you were doing with your nutrient budgeting before needs to be adjusted to take account of that. And you do find sometimes, I know some of the people on the call, when you have Covered stores and certainly separated slurry as well have actually gone to a system where you no longer need to apply nitrogen fertiliser. So again, that kind of helps maximise things, but you really need to consider that if you're going to cover a store. So we're kind of moving on to some of these new air quality capital options. These weren't available before. So we've got some examples, and I've also got, at the end of the slide, I've got some resources to AHDB that also helps describe how some of these things work as well, that are probably slightly better explained by AHDB than me. So there's two options here, which are slurry scrapers and low ammonia emission flooring. And these help to reduce ammonia emissions. Well, the scrapers obviously by just constantly removing any kind of, sort of like any of your kind of manure, slurry and urine that is on the floor. It stops it from mixing. The floors themselves are grooved or slatted that allows, the reason why it's produced is a kind of enzyme reaction between manure and urine. So that the longer they're in contact with each other, the more ammonia is produced. And because it's an enzyme reaction, it never stops. It's not, the enzyme itself, urease, isn't broken down. So the quicker you can separate urine from dung, from feces, the better. So the less ammonia is then produced from that housing. So we found that it improves as also kind of consequential benefits, that it improves foot health and animal comfort, reduces lameness. It's better air quality for the animals within those buildings, and obviously for your staff as well. And it reduces workload and labour costs. There are obviously associated costs with running slurry scrapers, but it can certainly reduce costs from tractor scraping from within a building. So I'm going to go into a couple of sort of more recent case studies around one of the most simplest things that we can do to help you kind of minimise inefficiencies, really, in ways that grants can help you, which this is a really unfortunate case of burst slurry store. This didn't happen in Cumbria. The store itself, you kind of look at that and think, well, that looks pretty standard loss. You kind of think, I've got one that looks like that, or my neighbours have got one that looks like that. So the store itself was rated for 2 million gallons of slurry. The farm was handed over, and that information was missed within the handover. The farmer who took over wasn't aware of the rating. So although it could hold more than that physically, it wasn't actually rated for the full volume that it could hold. So he'd allowed the slurry store to get up to the freeboard, and unfortunately it failed. So what was found in the investigation into why that failed was that the majority of the contents of the store was rainwater, and the rainwater that got into it had come from leaking downpipes that had been collected onto dirty areas and then had been stored as slurry. So around about 2/3 of the contents of that was rainwater. So you can sort of see from that store itself that investment would have been required eventually, but the store itself, the failure of that was avoidable just by the simple separation of clean and dirty water. So, my advice really around that is to kind of, if you're thinking about a grant, is to look up and have a look at what your gutters and downpipes all look like and where that clean water's heading. The second case study that I've got is a farmer that approached Chris, and initially the approach was to look at covering over a silage clamp and a little bit of concrete to help sort of reduce sediment running onto the road. The farm itself is very close to the River Eden, but the farm is also within the Vallum of Hadrian's Wall. So when the original application came in, as I was saying before, we need to think really carefully about, have we considered every single environmental factor? Are we getting the most for the environment from this application? And within that, thinking about the concrete and the roof, hadn't really considered that there were historical sites within on that SPI that needed to have management on them. So the application went back, and there was more land management options applied to it, but also because Chris had then been asked to help the farmer and had seen what was happening on the farm, had some sort of fresh input, some fresh ideas as to how to manage slurry. You can sort of see from the picture, the slurry store on that farm is very small and was inadequate for the farm's needs. So what Chris advised the farmer and helped the farmer to cost out was a new lagoon, which was built. And what that meant was that there was no longer any kind of inappropriate spreading in winter, that the lagoon held more than enough slurry for the entire winter and a little bit into the spring. So it meant that when it was spread at the right time. It just meant there was a really consequential benefit for the soil health on that farm, as well as what was eventually benefit as well from reducing rainwater inputs into the slurry store. So just to help you kind of get some ideas for how to make a successful grant application is really start with a plan. And if you don't have a plan, don't worry, that's why we are here. But to think about what the sources of pollution are, and what to kind of think about some of the things that I've talked about today, where that comes from, about how does that pollution potentially reach the environment? How does it get there? Think about kind of like your under drainage, kind of overland flow, that kind of thing, and what the receptor is, what's nearby you that can be affected. Excuse me. Use our advice. Excuse me. I think that's telling me something. Use our advice to aid your thought process and to check whether you need our support for certain items. I've got a list of those on the next slide. Consider really carefully the timing and planning around your grants. Think about Environment Agency support and planning permission, that kind of thing. Think about how busy your contractors are going to be. And the contingencies for your Cumbrian seasons. Somebody once told me it was now 12 months of autumn. And the final point is we do get really busy. So please pester us. We really do want to help you. There's just a really quick case study within that slide that some of you might recognise yourselves on that, is that was another farm where Chris helped a farmer move away from a slurry system that didn't quite meet the needs of the farm anymore. So it was potentially, well, principally around the amount of rainwater that was getting into the store from the silage clamp, which was then roofed over, and the farmer also went to a kind of bedded manure system as well. But one of the other benefits is that once you've covered over your silage clamp, it gives you a really handy space for having farmer meetings inside them as well. So here's our list of options that do require catchment sensitive farming officer approval. You will need to speak to us if you want to apply for any of these types of things. Like I said, the slides are available, and this is available within the stewardship manual as well. A few easy steps for you to get started. Have a look at Magic to see whether or not you're in a priority area. Identify your capital items and management options. Obviously, seek our advice. We can't consider any kind of application if we haven't received your proposal form in time, unfortunately. There's your key dates again, and think about if you've got a yard parcel, if you want to do your works in your yard and it's not mapped, you need an RLE1 form to get a parcel number, so please make sure that you're applying for those as quickly as possible, and talk to the Environment Agency if you're looking at anything to do with slurry stores or silage clamps that needs their consent. These are our contact details. I should have also probably given you our email addresses as well, so we can probably put those on the slide pack after it. And then just very, very briefly, I know I'm probably running over time a little bit, but slurry investment scheme is something that DEFRA will be funding in the future. And this is a separate funding stream, which is planned for, well, it's probably slipped a little bit now, but it was planned for later on this year into next year to start. However, these dates are unconfirmed, but it's to support farmers with improving slurry management infrastructure, slurry storage infrastructure. The full details and the full funding for this, not confirmed yet, but we know that it's coming. We've had something previously in the past, some of you might have encountered the FARG scheme in the past. There were some lessons to be learned from that. So one of them was around allowing the proposal to be long enough for you to actually plan this out properly to get the advice that you need. So the proposal is to be made available for about 3 years. The most important point I would say around this is likely to be extremely heavily subscribed. So I would, if you are interested, I think I really need to start investing in my slurry storage, to start thinking about it now, start thinking about what kind of planning permission you're going to need, think about your kind of location and structures. So seeking professional advice around that, because we know that the planning and design process can be really time consuming. However, you can reduce your costs by innovation and by having really good design, so it's worth thinking about it. And as Andy's going to go into as well, is that the investment fund might help with slurry spreading equipment. So think about that in the context of how those things will work together. So that is my final slide. I'm sorry there's not a whole lot of information out there yet about a slurry investment scheme, but it is coming. So as soon as we know, we'll obviously do more sessions on it to let you know about that. And just my last slide is to say that we know that change is overwhelming, and the pace and the scale of the change can feel really overwhelming, and there's a lot of help out there for you. That it doesn't have to be drastic. It can be small things, it can be quick wins that you can make on your farms that can make a huge difference. So we've put some resources on here to help you. Some of that is around on the gov.uk website, and some of it is separate things around helping you with ammonia planning tools and farm mapping, things like that, and also some health advice and mental health advice as well, and some technical advice on HDB as well. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for that, and hopefully that's been really helpful, and we'll hear from you soon.
Okay, Susan, so maybe if you stop sharing your screen, we can see as many of us as we can, and I've got quite a long list of questions. So I'm going to try and go through the questions that we've got on the chat function relatively in order, but there are a few that are common. And the first question I've got down is, can you do mid-tier and capital grant together? Susan, you're on mute.
So yes, if you are going for a mid-tier, you can put capital items in it. Okay,
and I think there's a further question somewhere down. I'm just checking through, but I'm not sure if it's on here, but it's a question I've been asked. If you're already in a mid-tier agreement, say you're 2 years in or 3 years into an existing mid-tier agreement, can you separately now apply for capital grants, whether that's water capital or air quality?
So if your parcel, if you want to apply for options on a parcel that's not currently in the scheme, that's fine. What I would recommend in those sort of circumstances is that you check separately with the RPA as to whether or not that's going to be possible, as to whether or not, you know, if you have options on land that's currently included within that scheme that are not due to end or are there for the duration of the, the 5 years, you'll need to check with the RPA to actually get any kind of permissions that you might need for that to happen. I can't really say, because each agreement is different.
I was just going to add
to that. If you've got a field parcel, like the farmyard is tied up, so you've already got options on that farmyard, and that's where you want to have your, say, air quality options that weren't available when you went into a mid-tier scheme. We haven't got an answer on this yet, but it is a question that we've put back to the RPA because it will affect quite a number of people, and they want to try and sort out air quality sooner rather than later. And we know that we've got this kind of deadline of 2027 to get all this kind of stuff sorted out. So we'll come back to you with that when we get an answer from the RPA.
But one of the other things as well that's worth considering is that yard parcels are on their AB1, aren't they? And buildings are AB9. So it might very well be that a building could be considered to be a separate thing. But like say they're sort of land use codes that are used for BPS. They're a separate land use code. So it might very well be that the RPA make it a bit easier for those options to be applied. But yeah, we'll have to come back to you on that.
So this is although I've jumped down the question list, but I think it's a question. So are the air quality items expected to stay in for a number of years, as we wanted to go for an air quality item, but the shed's land parcel number is already locked under a mid-tier agreement and won't be out until 2023. So there's two parts of that. First one we kind of covered, but secondly, are the air quality items likely to continue?
Yeah.
Any idea? We say yes, but is it like 2 years, 3 years, 10 years?
They'll be available as long as the scheme's available, as far as I've understood. There's no plans to take them out.
Okay. I'm going to just go back on one. I've got Stephen Crabtree just asking about planning. So saying, if you apply for the grant now, are you committed, even though planning permission will take time and may not be granted?
No, you're not committed to anything. If for whatever reason the option, the capital option that you've chosen, doesn't end up happening, there's no penalty to it. If you discover, you know, at a later date that it's not going to happen, you just withdraw that option from the agreement.
Okay, I'm just moving down the questions because we've got quite a long list. This was sort of a comment really from Andy and a question. So if you have steel items in stock which meet the relevant standards, can these be used for water quality items such as roofing over yards? With the rising price of steel up over 50% in recent months and the increase in workloads on contractors to erect sheds, can we place a deposit on items now to secure our place in the queue?
That's a really good question. It used to be something that was possible under the old grant scheme, but I'm going to have to find out about whether or not you can use things that you've already got in stock or put a deposit on. I don't know. Do you have any other insights into that, Chris? I think that we're going to have to go back to the RPA to find out about
that. I don't. I do know that, yeah, clearly the price of steel has gone up, and whether that will stay high, because a lot of it is to do with complications of shipping, partly to do with COVID and things like that, because we import a lot of steel from China these days. So whether that hike in the steel price will remain, I don't know. The rules currently state that if you don't need to submit invoices with a completed claim, but you do need to keep any relevant invoices pertinent to that claim for up to 5 years, which could be inspected. So potentially you could run the risk of not having sufficient invoices to cover the cost of your project, you know, that is relevant to roofing. I think we'll just need to get a little bit more clarity about that, because it appears to me that you shouldn't really buy materials in before you have a live agreement, because then those materials would not be eligible costs as the rules stand just now.
Okay. Now, if Neil Carter, if you're on the call and you're able to unmute, we've got a question from you in the chat, but I do know that this is something that you've got recent experience with on planning. So Neil, if you want to speak up, otherwise I will give your comment. I'm looking for Neil. Where have you gone, Neil? Okay, so Neil, I just can't see you. Speak up if you and interrupt me if you want to, but just I know that Neil Carter. Hooray!
Hello, I'm here. I'm in the car, so.
I hope you're not driving.
Oh no, I've just pulled over.
So Neil, if you just want to, you put some information in the chat, but I know that this is something you've had recent experience of. If you just want to share that experience briefly.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything that's been said has been really, really useful. And I think that the key message is about planning ahead, because there's a number of sort of snowball effects that can happen. There was the comment before about covering existing slurry stores, but the Sappho Regs, which relate to stores built after 1991, which have minimum storage requirements attached to them. If your store was built pre-91 and it doesn't currently have to comply with Sappho, if you try and make a substantial alteration, Sappho kicks in and all of a sudden you need minimum storage requirements. So that store that you're trying to cover might not comply and you might need a whole new slurry store. I did also see in the transition document that was published in November that there's talk this year of a consultation on minimum slurry storage requirements. So everything's pointing to the fact that just covering over an existing store, even if it's quite a new one, might result in increased capacity needed. So it is going to be quite a big project to sit down and work out what is actually going to tick all of the boxes, meet all of the rules and regs, and leave you with a facility that's working at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that's, and also there is Neil did an article on it just recently. I've circulated that in RE News and I can send that round if anybody's interested. The next question I've got is, how do you get the slurry out of the pit if it's not diluted with rainwater? How can the slurry be spread when it is too thick to go into the tanker?
Yeah, so obviously we appreciate that dairy slurry is a lot thinner than beef slurry, but I suppose there's a few different ways of thinking about that, and a few different ways of doing it as well. Is that obviously if it's separated, if it goes through a separator, then the liquid fraction of that is much easier to spread. But also as well is that you can add rainwater back into it, but the point of separating clean and dirty water from your farmyards and roofs and all that kind of thing is that you can control it. So you can control how much goes in it. It's not, you know, if we're finding, like from our case studies, is that the rainwater that's going in is completely uncontrolled to the extent that you're having to spread it in winter. That's not really a matter of it's going in there to help you thin it. Well, there's too much rainwater going in there. So you can control the amount of rainwater that goes in to make it thin enough to spread, you know, and that's completely acceptable. We understand that.
And following on from that, a question, will there be grants for slurry separators?
There's not currently a grant for that. I think, were they in the old productivity scheme? I can't remember now.
They were, and this was something that we talked about the last few weeks with DEFRA, and we asked this question about slurry separators, and there was a strong indication that there would be grants on separators, because at least it was understood that separators might be, for some farmers, the best solution, just as you explained to the last question. If potentially a separator could enable the liquid fraction and the solid fraction to be handled separate, and so you wouldn't need to add rainwater in to achieve the same results. I mean, on another farm, the example that you showed, where actually the farmer went off a slurry system because the slurry was that thick and that heavy that he was going to put that much rainwater in to make it work. It wasn't actually worth the bother, so it actually turned it into manure instead. So there are several different ways of going about it, but you can't have a one size fits all. And each farm will need to then think very carefully about what its solution is. But yeah, I think there will be, my guess is there will be grants on separators. It just hasn't been announced yet.
Okay. The next question I've had asked by a number of people, both beforehand and by Robert on this call. We're not in a high priority area for water quality. Can we get the water quality grants? In this case, Robert's saying because we qualified for a boundary one last year. I don't believe they're linked, Robert. So I think the question really is, are those high priority areas for water capital grants going to be reviewed? And are they going to be the same for air quality grants? I know there's a few on the call that probably want to ask that.
Currently, they're the same for air quality and water quality. So the short but unfortunate answer to your question just now is that if you're not in a high priority area just now, no, you can't get the water quality grant. I believe that the air quality priority areas are going to be reviewed.
And a follow-on quick question is, the air quality grants, the air quality priority areas are going to be reviewed, but is there going to be a review of the water quality areas as well, or are they set in stone? Because obviously there's a massive difference between the funding for slurry store covers and tracks, etc., if you're in a high priority area as opposed to being out of that.
I mean, just to kind of go into the background as to why there are high and medium and low priority areas, is that in the high priority areas, we know that that's where we can make the biggest difference. In the medium or low priority areas, certainly in the medium priority areas, that's where we would like to work, but we just don't simply have the resource to do it. I mean, fortunately, in the Eden catchment, most of it is high priority, so that's good, but it doesn't cover the whole country. So in areas where it's low priority, we just can't say that agriculture is having we can't make a significant impact on some of the pollutants that are affecting the water costs in those areas. So it's kind of showing that in those areas, agriculture is not having a significant impact on either water quality or air quality. So I guess those things are always subject to review as water quality is tested and as we find out, as we get more evidence. How that will change in future funding streams, I'm not sure. I can't see a change to the the water quality priority areas within the current stewardship scheme, but unless anybody knows any better.
Okay, so I think the only plea I would make on behalf of some of the farmers I've spoken to recently is it makes a massive difference financially as to whether you can get help towards covering slurry stores, and I think they would feel that maybe that mapping needs to be reviewed, and it's a massive issue for their viability going forward. I've still got questions coming through, and I've still got to come back to Andy to do a little bit of a case study and finish us off, probably in more ways than one. So just covering some of the other questions, is there a grant coming out for installing new underground slurry storage tanks that will be covered?
That might potentially, we don't know yet about the detail of what's going to be in the slurry investment scheme, but I mean, I guess all things could be considered. Obviously, if it is underground, then it covered. So that's something that would obviously work well certainly for air quality.
And another one from Stephen. Do both the separated liquid and the solid both need covering?
For different reasons. Obviously, the solid needs covering so that you don't end up separating the liquid out and then getting rainwater back in it again, and the effluent running out. The liquid fraction would still contain sort of rainwater and urine and all that kind of thing. So potentially, it would normally go into a tank anyway. So that means that would be covered. So yeah, I would cover, obviously your liquid fraction should be contained within a tank, and the solid would do well to be covered to prevent effluent escape.
Okay, and a final question just for this section, because I need to leave enough time for Andy, but is covering slurry storage to keep the rainwater out or the gas in, i.e. is a roof enough, or does it have to actually seal so that the gas isn't getting out?
That's a really good question, and it is for both. So obviously it does a really good job of keeping the rainwater out, and the less air flow there is over the top of the tank, then the less volatilisation of ammonia there is. Those kind of like those things that look like a sort of tent top obviously keep the air in. They do have vents in them so that you can vent it out. But that's a kind of control measure as well. So as you vent it, you're not venting as much as would be lost through volatilisation if it was totally empty. So the covers themselves, the ones that are sealed, are obviously the best option.
So I've already got, I can see on my screen, I've got one farmer with his head in his hands like this.
Oh dear.
I'm not going to say who it is. he's looking at me now. He's like, oh God. Yeah, we were. I think probably it's time to move on to the last sort of section of the night, which is Andy talking just a bit about planning that investment and a case study about how you might do that. I am conscious it's coming up to 8:10, and I try to keep the Zooms within an hour and a half. We have had a lot of questions tonight. We've got a lot of people on the call, so I might have to just go slightly over that. So we will have another question session at the end of Andy's call, and I'll also open it up to people asked questions by using their voice. But I'm going to just hand over to Andy again, just to finish the presentations.
Okay, thank you very much to Susan and to Chris for that. Hopefully, I'm not going to guarantee you're going to get your head out of your hands by the time I've finished, but this might be a bit of a clue as to where we're coming. Neil's touched on it, both Chris and Susan have touched on it, is get your head round planning. That's not just in terms of planning permissions, but it's planning for the future. So I'll spare the blushes of these very kind people who allowed me to invade their privacy on their farm to sort of give you a bit of a case study. And yeah, this is an actual farm in the Eden Valley. You can see my cursor, but this farm has 2 silage pits, first cut and second cut pit. You're very typical on a dairy farm. It has an uncovered slurry lagoon, which is about 5-6 foot deep, concrete panels, and a lot of exposed concrete. which attracts rainwater, which ultimately ends up in the slurry store. Public road here with potential for water to come off that public road as the ground is sloping away down here to the watercourse, which is hiding in the trees down here. Parlour over here, cattle housing here and here and here. So this thought process was started a couple of weeks ago, really, in the realization that there's an awful lot coming. As I said, we've got stormy weather ahead, and we now need to plan this road ahead. So this farm, typical or atypical, you might say, of Cumbria, but 110 cows, flying herd, all at grass, with an element of diversification in the business as well already. Current storage, 100,000 gallons, which in a dry year and a dry winter would probably just about keep things going if it was just the cow slurry that was going in there. But like a lot of farms, pretty much all the rainwater, either on the uncovered yards or from other areas, was heading down towards the slurry store. So roughly 2,100 square meters of yard was feeding water into the slurry store, along with the parlour washings. As Susan said, rainfall in Cumbria is, averages 60 inches. This one's probably slightly more fortunate in that it's only got 1,300 millimeters as opposed to 1,500 millimeters of rain, but still effectively a huge amount of water falling on every square meter of yard. And this farm had used capital grants previously to help, let's say, fix the broken concrete in the collecting yard and where the milk tanker turned around, and also valuably to start sorting out broken and missing guttering. So the first stage on this farm really was to calculate the storage requirement, and we looked and said, right, okay, if nothing changes, and we know that the slurry investment scheme is going to potentially give us a grant to then come up with 6 months storage capacity on this farm, and this will be part of the slurry investment scheme, is ensuring that you have 6 months, minimum 6 months storage capacity for slurry on the farm. So if nothing changed, so we left all that rainwater disappearing into the slurry lagoon, kept the cow numbers the same, potentially, then this farm would need 500,000 gallons of slurry storage if nothing had changed at all. The business wanted to stay in milk. There was a next generation coming through. They could see the future there. It was very much what the farm was about. So the planning was, how could this farm then begin to make those changes now that would enable it to continue to farm, could meet future permitting regulations when they come in terms of ammonia emissions, and basically to meet the challenges that were coming around the corner. So yep, already started on looking at all the gutters and downspouts, and this is part of the process now, is to work out which ones are still functioning. If they are, then where's that water going? Where's that clean water going? Can we change that passage of that clean water, as Susan said, and put it somewhere where it goes into clean water drains and then doesn't need to be dealt with? And then if it's going across yards, then how do we try and mitigate that? What can we put in to then reduce the amount of dirty water going across those yards and then potentially now becoming slurry? And then in about all that, looking at where the yard drains go to as well. So therefore, can you separate clean and dirty water underground? And if not, then what can you do to change that? So on the back of that, the program was beginning to formulate as to what could be done. So using the grants that Susan's talking about, and this farm was really interested in the capital grant scheme. So that sort of 20,000 pot within the 60,000 overall that would enable them to then start this program. So the first program is then to submit an application this year to then hopefully have one come live in 2022, or maybe even later this year, hopefully, because we're told that there could be a shortened time frame on these capital grants. Similar in many ways that we've seen to the hedgerow and boundary ones, with them coming out in August, September time, rather than having to wait until November, December time, or even now January, February time before you know where you're going. So first cut silage pit was to be roofed. and continue to sort out gutters and sumps. Then next year, apply again, because we've got separate field numbers. And at the moment, we understand that we can still go back into separate field numbers and then put in a second claim, second application the following year. And then the third year to then look at within other field parcels there, or going back into existing ones, having completed the program and close those down, to then look at roofing over additional things like the collecting yard, outside feed areas, and continue to improve that yard drainage. So potential there to use, £60,000 worth of grant aid spread over the next 3 to 4 years to begin to achieve the aim of where this farm needed to be. So we said, okay, right, we take all those bits of farmyard out, we put them under roofs, we soak out the clean and dirty water. And now the slurry storage requirement is now down to under 200,000 gallons for the same number of cows. So potentially now, Susan said, we anticipate later this year that we'll know a little bit more about the slurry investment scheme, with potentially then hopefully applications going in from 2022. And that grant scheme will theoretically run until 2025, when the new environmental permitting regulations begin to kick in and all the clean air thing that we started off this discussion with begins to come in then. So we do have a fairly tight timescale, to get these in. And as Susan and Chris said, these are competitive. There will be huge amount of competition for all of this. So starting this process now, it becomes even more vitally important. We spoke about the slurry investment scheme. We know, or we're being told, that there will be pipe work, infrastructure and other things that will be covered by that grant scheme. So again, beginning to assess now what you're going to need will become very much part of that planning process in terms of actually putting the planning application in, but also part of planning ahead as to how you're going to deal with that store. And that store could be then relocated, somewhere where it's more central to the silage ground, more central to where it's being used. So therefore reducing compaction, reducing traffic, around the farm. So beginning to assess where the best place for your potential new lagoon would be. But here, going from 500,000 down to 200,000 storage, a huge saving potentially in investment. We've no idea what the grant's going to be. It's going to be 80%, 70%, 50%, 60%, but any saving, from having to produce, potentially construct a smaller store is going to be much better from your bottom line. And then we could look at how the existing slurry store could now basically come as a dirty water store. So the washings from the parlour and things that possibly couldn't be redirected to the slurry store, the new slurry store, could then effectively go into the dirty water store. And as this also had a ramp in it, so it could become another store for muck and everything else as well. So really, to sort of sum up where we've been going now, is that the grants are here now for water and air quality. As Susan says, you've got to get that information through to your catchment sensitive farming officer by the 19th of March if you want to apply for those grants. And you have to have the application in by the end of April, but consequently you should have a much quicker turnaround and should know later this year whether you've been successful or not. Mid-tier, where you can incorporate those water or capital items with a higher threshold. It's £20,000 for each section of the capital grant, but it's 120,000 for water capital within the or air capital within the stewardship, and 50,000 for boundaries. Again, get the information to your catchment sensitive farming officer by the 15th of May if you want those water or air capital items, and then make sure you've got your pack applied for by the 28th of May, and then get your application in by the 30th of July. I'm not sure, maybe Chris and Susan will help you tell me, because last year the online packs we had until the end of June, so maybe they can clarify as to whether that's still the case.
Yeah, it is.
That is, right, okay, so that's sort of paper application pack by the 28th of May. Thank you, Susan. And then, yeah, the Farming Investment Fund, which we've touched on very briefly, will be coming out again later this year. That should incorporate low emission slurry spreading equipment in the way that they have done in the past. We anticipate a launch in the autumn winter of this year. We anticipate it will be two, or maybe should I say maybe two strands to it. So we'll have a sort of a countryside productivity small scheme and a larger scheme. And we've been told, and there's a lot of discussion going on, that the threshold, which under the old scheme, which some of you may have attracted investment from, and this will be a brand new scheme, so everybody will get back to start. We're turning the clock back. It's back to, you're back to square one again. So we shouldn't be concerned if you've already had 2 or 3 bites of the cherry. You'll get a chance again. And we've been told potentially that there could be a raise in the threshold. It was set at £12,000 grant. That may rise to 20 or 25,000. And what we've been pushing at stakeholder level is for the reduction in the threshold, from the current minimum of £3,000 worth of grant to a much lower threshold, or removing that altogether, to sort of make the schemes more widely available, so the smaller producers can see an opportunity to invest in equipment. And this is new technology. This is not just low emission spreading, but it's the GPS stuff, it's your animal health and welfare stuff as well. And then the bigger scheme, which we think will be coming out later on this year as well, will be very much focused at the major infrastructure investment. So the bigger types of kit that and we've been pushing hard for contractors to be able to be eligible to access these grant schemes, because obviously that's a one-to-many approach, where you've got a contractor being able to invest in really high-tech kit to be able to not just drive down emissions, but to also drive down soil compaction and improve soil health from having machinery and the capacity to deal with things. And then, yes, we've touched recently on the Slurry Investment Fund. More to come later on this year. As Susan said and Chris said, we're in a very fast-moving sort of scenario at the moment. There's going to be a huge amount of information coming out this year, really setting the scene for the future. But the key thing really is to sort of begin your planning process now. Speak to as many people as you can, get as many people on your farm as you can who can help you. Chris and Susan, hopefully at some point, as we move out of lockdown, they're going to be able to come out again, later on, hopefully in the summertime. But certainly they're there at the end of the phone, or the end of an online call, or through your professional advisors to help you just sort of get the process started, because we do need to get that process started. So whether really this is your viewpoint here, but I tend to think that actually that's the viewpoint that we should all be looking for, that this is definitely a road to opportunity within your businesses. And we have this 4 to 5 year period now where we can really grasp those opportunities and begin to take our farm businesses forward and keep on producing the food that we all need to keep on producing.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I haven't actually got any new questions on the chat, which is unusual for tonight. So please put some questions on the chat whilst I'm just asking one of my own. So Andy, and Susan and Chris, the new slurry investment scheme that will cover slurry storage, going back to our discussion about high priority areas for water quality, can you see that scheme being limited in any way geographically, or will it, or can you see if it's competitive, how will they prioritise applications?
I think the simple question is, we really do not know, sadly, at the moment. Would that be right, Susan and Chris, that it is intended as a national scheme? It's not intended, as my understanding, to be purely driven by water quality, because it's going to be driven by, as Susan touched on this, the Dame Glenys Stacey review to a large extent, in terms of the fact that we've moved very rapidly from an industry where we've lost a lot of farms who are dairying and other things out of the system, but we still have a huge amount of slurry to deal with, and this is the golden opportunity nationally to sort of get that back under control. Or, as I say, if you do your planning and you decide that actually you can move to a rough muck system on your farm, or you can make changes, or what sort of changes do you need to make to help you get the best out of what's coming, really.
Chris and Susan, do you want to add anything onto that?
I'll have a go, and then Susan, if she's got anything else to add. DEFRA, we had a chat with DEFRA a couple of weeks ago about how the slurry store grants would be targeted, and trying to sort of get an idea of what size of budget they were talking about, because actually, if every slurry store, this is for England only, So if every slurry store was going to be targeted, I think that we were talking about billions of pounds, which I don't think it's going to, the budget isn't going to go that far. So there will need to be a competitive element to it. There's a crossover here between what we're trying to achieve in terms of air quality, which doesn't just influence protected sites, and what we're trying to do in water quality. So those of you in current target areas are in a good position to think about both the needs of your business, and you might have a somewhat competitive edge over others who are not currently in target areas. But certainly for farmers in medium water quality areas, I would certainly still be thinking about it. And if you're out of any water quality target areas, I would still think very hard about what your business needs are, because you've got this opportunity to think and plan for what you need, and I would do that first, whilst we find out the final details about how much, what the grant rates would be, whether it's standard rates, whether it's percentage rates, and you know, the finer details will come out towards the second half of this year. But almost irrespective of where you sit in the country, you know, sorting out slurry storage, clean and dirty water separation, and where the balance is between the two, you know, as per Andy Dyer's example just now, this is your time for planning. So I wouldn't panic about trying to get into this year's grant round. You know, the most important thing is to think about what your strategic business needs are, and do that planning exercise as a number one priority, and then the devil of the detail of the schemes will become clearer the middle of this year.
I think that's wise words, Chris. I'm conscious we're coming up to 8:30 and we've been Zooming for an hour and a half, which is about enough for anybody. And I do want to just give people the chance on the call that haven't been able to use the chat function to ask any questions that you have. So I'm going to shut myself up and just say, if you do want to ask a question now, just unmute yourself and shout, and I'll be quiet for a second.
They were on about planning for slurry stores and stuff like this, but there was somebody on about triple SIs. If you're next to a triple SI, it makes it a lot more difficult to get planning. Can you help me any more with that? A bit more accuracy?
I might ask Chris to answer that one. I think it was Neil Carter from SAC, who's also somewhere on the call, but I think he's on his phone in his car. So it is something that he's highlighted, but Chris might be able to help with that.
I suppose, so if you are wanting to locate it, let's say a new slurry store or infrastructure right next to a river triple SI, there are rules already there about you can't locate slurry stores within 50 meters of a watercourse. I mean, so there are some rules kind of already there that are not specifically about triple SIs, but if it depends what kind of triple SI it is and whether what you're proposing to do has
we're next to a common, which is a triple SI, Crosby Riversworth Common, and we're right next to the common, you see, and that's a triple SI.
Okay. So there is an issue about if you're are you thinking about for a slurry store? Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, my slurry store's just our farm's right next to the boundary of the wall. The slurry store is like 100 meters away from the boundary.
Okay, so I can see where you're heading now. If so, in terms of the planning process, you're putting up a slurry store, and let's say there are.
We already have one. We have an existing. Sorry, we have an existing one. It'll just need. It's 30-odd-year-old, so if we need a cover on it, we'll automatically you might as well put a new slurry store up. So I probably would need planning, wouldn't I?
You will need planning, but in terms of helping you through that process, because at the end of it, your covered slurry stores will not only enable you to get through 6 months of storage. So the slurry store grant will be expecting your stores to get you to 6 months storage and be covered. So the combination of those two things will actually have a beneficial effect on the SSSI, because you won't be spreading slurry on land that's near the SSSI where there could be ammonia or nitrate drift, if you like, and there won't be unnecessary emissions coming from the slurry store. So those are beneficial things to the SSSI, not reasons to refuse it.
Yeah,
and there
well,
are problems
that's
with.
what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are problems with in the planning process at the moment. The background level for ammonia deposition on sensitive sites. So this is more to do with sites with liverworts and bryophytes and mosses, where you could apply for putting up a new slurry store, and ostensibly without that greater information, they might say no because the background level is already higher than it should be. But we've worked with 1 2 farmers where that's been the initial response and found a way round that, because we're keen to ensure that that we all see the bigger picture and we're all trying to achieve the same thing. So there might be a more detailed conversation to come back with on that one.
So I have got Neil Carter just put something on the chat, and he might want to say this himself, but Neil's saying if you look on magic.gov.uk, which is the online DEFRA mapping tool, and look at something called impact risk zones, depending on your proximity to a SSSI, the local planning authority may have to engage with Natural England to assess potential ammonia emissions. So I think the answer in your case may be to sort of look at this early, in case that you need to have further discussions with Natural England because of where you're sited. Neil, are you able to unmute and just talk to that a little bit? I can see you're still on the call.
Yes, hello, hi. Yeah, the impact risk zone stuff, it's something I've had to look at with a couple of farms just recently. And if you look on magic.gov.uk and search for the impact risk zones under the designations, essentially, if you're really close to a SSSI, it doesn't matter how big a slurry store you're looking at, the local planning authority will have to communicate with Natural England to look at the impacts. But then the further away you get from the sensitive habitat, it depends on the size of the facility. And it also talks about livestock sheds, slurry stores, and middens. So if you get further away from the SSSI, it's the floor space of the new shed or the capacity of the slurry store or the size of the midden that dictates whether Natural England have to get involved to look at the ammonia emissions produced. But I mean, they'll be looking at things like sort of mitigation things you can do, which might involve some of the grant items that have already been discussed. But I know quite a few people are just looking at screens, like planting trees around the facilities, which will reduce the emissions emitted from them. So it might be that it's another step to go through that hopefully, fingers crossed, won't be too onerous if it's just the case of you have to look at the emissions and you immediately propose you're going to screen it off with a shelter belt. If that doesn't suit, then it might be having to look at some of those other things that have already been discussed from an ammonia perspective, like the housing itself, scrapers and floors.
Yeah, because I was talking to the Loon catchment area officer, and he said they might come and sort of look around my farm and say I might need to put a roof over a dirty yard or a midden and things like that, which we are doing at the moment. I've got a grant for a dirty yard already, which I'm going to be putting a roof on that this summer.
Yeah, all of those sorts of things count.
And that sort of thing. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Veronica, you're not on. You might.
Sorry, basic Zoom error. Thank you, Neil, for just sharing. I knew that you've recently had experience with planning issues. It's after Hopper State. I'll just take one more question. If anybody wants to speak up that hasn't had a chance so far on the chat, does anybody else want to have a final go at a question? Speak up now. Okay. Well, if I haven't got any further questions, and I'm sorry that tonight's been possibly less interactive than we like to have. We've never done a webinar because we actually like to have people sort of chatting with each other and sharing their experience, and doing that with 80 plus farmers is hard on Zoom. Really impressed that so many of you have had a go at the chat function. We've had some really interesting questions, which I know a number of farmers have asked me over recent days as well. I think the level of interest in this meeting has made us realise we need to run more on this subject as things develop and more information becomes available on some of these schemes. I'm really conscious it is confusing, and my specialism is grants, and I've identified sort of 4 different sources of grants that you might be interested in from 4 different schemes. The air quality grants, the water capital grants, the slurry investment scheme, the farming investment fund. It's confusing enough for advisors, let alone for yourselves that are trying to run your businesses and plan for the future. So we will try and run more meetings on this topic as more information becomes available. I will send out an email after this meeting. I will include the presentations. I'll include as many links as I can think of, including to the Catchment Sensitive Farming Officer list, because some of you will be lucky enough to have Chris and Susan in the River Eden catchment, but many of you are from further afield as well. So I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. I'm going to thank Susan and Andy very much for joining us tonight, and realising just how many people you were speaking to. When we started organising this meeting, we thought, oh, we'll have 20 or 30. And as the numbers started increasing over the last week, we started panicking a bit. So thank you to both of you for braving the largest Zoom call I've ever chaired, and to Chris Turner for also joining the call to share his knowledge, and to Neil, who shared his experience on the planning side. We funded this workshop through something called Cumbria Growth Catalyst, and there is still a few free one-to-one business reviews available for up to 3 hours with Andy to discuss the future for your business. 3 hours doesn't get you very far, but it does start you that discussion about what's happening next with farm support payments, what your options are for the future, and we can also give you some preliminary thoughts on things like stewardship and these grants. So please email me back after this meeting if you're interested in finding out more. So I'm going to just close the meeting down. Thank you to everybody that's carried on through the meeting, and we hope to organise more of these in the future. So good evening, good night, and goodbye.